I now have Keesje Wassink ready for his presentation. Again, go look at the bios. If you haven't met Keesje before, he's one of the technical officers at the VBA. He's going to talk to you about the Building Surveyor Audit Program. Thanks, Keesje.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Welcome, everyone. And I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. In this session, we will discuss our RBS audit program and the findings in relation to Class 2 apartment buildings. So the RBS audit program was developed to address Building Confidence Report Recommendation 7 and the ministerial expectation of delivering stronger regulatory oversight of practitioners. As part of this, the VBA has committed to an audit program that will see all registered building surveying practitioners performing functions under the Act audited at least once every 3 years. The program's purpose is to improve confidence in the building industry, protect good performers, improve the quality of deficient performers, provide insight and data for practitioner education and possible legislative reforms, and provide areas of focus for our VBA programs, including the Proactive Inspections Program. Like the Proactive Inspections Program, the data and trends will be published and the information will be used to educate industry. Our goal is to help practitioners meet the legislative requirements and to maintain high practitioner performance standards. The audit reports completed today, as Andrew mentioned, is the Class 1 buildings in bushfire-prone areas, and shortly we will publish the Class 2 apartment buildings and swimming pools as well. These will be available on the VBA's website under our desktop audit section, and you can also find the Proactive Inspections team report in that area as well. So currently there are 421 active building surveyors, and that's those that are issuing building permits. In 2021, we completed 279 audits from 121 unique RBSs. The practitioners and buildings were selected using a risk-based selection criteria, utilising data from across the VBA, such as the proactive inspection results, complaints data, and practitioner discipline to identify areas of high risk. These audits couldn't have been completed without the cooperation of councils that have made the required Section 30 documentation available, and also the practitioners that have provided their responses and addressed the items, and we thank them for their cooperation. So before I discuss the audit findings, I will provide some background information on the auditing process. So when undertaking the audits, 4 elements are considered: whether a DTS clause would be applicable to satisfy the performance requirement. If the clause is applicable, then whether there was sufficient information in the documentation for the relevant building surveyor to determine compliance, and what compliance was used, e.g. was it deemed to satisfy or a performance solution or a combination of these. And then lastly, we look at whether the information was compliant, non-compliant, or we were unable to determine the outcome. So how do we kind of judge the compliance level? So there's 3 compliance levels, and I've got them illustrated on the screen here with an example related to stairs. So an item is deemed compliant where there is sufficient information to be satisfied that the clause has been complied with, either through DTS or a performance solution or a combination of these. So in example A, we can see there's sufficient information to determine the stairs going and rises are DTS compliant. Where there is insufficient information, for example, where there's no details of what the going and rises are, such as in example B, we'd mark this as unable to determine. And then lastly, in example C, we can see that there's actually a physical non-compliance because the going there the rise. Which one? That there's a riser that's not the right height. The going's not the right height, sorry. So the audits focus on key areas. So to ensure a high value audit program, The audits are scoped based on risk assessment to align to the focus on known risks and the VBA's register of harms, including fires in buildings, building collapse and structural damage, drowning, children drowning, threats to life safety, and water ingress. For Class 2 apartment buildings, the audit focused on 5 key areas of the NCC. These were Section B, structure, Section C, fire resistance, Section D, access and egress, Section E, services and equipment, and Section F, weatherproofing. Of the 63 audits completed on the Class 2 apartments, all had items that did not demonstrate that the compliance was achieved. The results of the audit had for sufficient documentation for the building surveyor to make a determination on compliance varied from 18% for weatherproofing to 92% for provision of escape. The results of the audits for compliance also varied from 18% for weatherproofing and a high of 89% for provision of escape. So I'll now run through some of the key findings for the 5 specific areas. So common items we found for structure were where performance requirement BP1 structural reliability required, among other things, that earthquake actions be considered when using a DTS solution. AS 1170.4 earthquake actions in Australia had not been applied in all required cases. There were inconsistencies between the structural and architectural drawings, and the certificates issued under Section 238 of the Act were inaccurate or incomplete and may not pass the Section 128 good faith test. While Section 128 might remove liability when certificates issued under Section 238 are relied on in good faith, when given by a registered building practitioner, good faith does require a level of oversight. It is not expected that you will take an in-depth check of calculation, as this is outside our skill level, but it would be expected that any obvious deficiencies are addressed, e.g. the inconsistencies between architectural and engineering plans or design actions not accounted for, that certificates are completed and accurate. We found that certificates were referencing the wrong building classification, the wrong volume of the NCC and the wrong clauses. And lastly, that all the actions have been considered. So the reliance on certificates issued under Section 238 has been discussed in the Practitioner Education Series webinar, Site Inspections and Enforcement, presented by Bronwyn last year, as Andrew mentioned before. And whilst it was related to inspection certificates, it can still kind of be applied to those certificates for design. And as they mentioned, you can find this on the VBA's website and YouTube channel with our PES seminar webinars. So for fire resistance and stability, one of our key findings relates to type of construction and in particular the use of clause C1.5. So we audited 25 buildings with a rise in stories of 2 and 10 were classed as type C construction when they should have been type B under a DTS solution. So we've got the clause up on the screen and we're going to do a quick poll just to gauge your understanding of the application of C1.5. So we'll give you about 30 seconds to respond to that. So we've got the 4 buildings on the screen here. And the question is, which of these buildings can the concession be applied to? So the classifications of the building are more than 10% and the floor area, and there is access to at least 2 exits or direct access or road or open space in all of the buildings. So hopefully the poll's coming up on the screen there for you, and you can go across to the poll section on the right of your screen and pop your answer in, whether you think building A, building B, building C or building D can have this concession applied to it. So I'm not. So we've got some mixed results there. Majority are going for building B, some have selected building A. We've got some for building C, Also got some for building D. So I'll just give you a few more seconds to kind of think about which one. So kind of got the majority overwhelmingly going for building B, and then we've got a kind of a split there for building C. So the answer here is, and the majority have picked this, is building B, and it's only building B. The clause requires buildings to contain only that class or a mixture of class 2 or 3. So building A, building C, and building D all contain a class of building that is not class 2 or not class 3. So building B contains a mixture of class 2 and has a rise in story of 2. Therefore, the concession can be applied to it. If you wanted to adopt type C construction requirements in the other 3 buildings, then you would need to do this via a performance solution. And also just note that this same kind of concept applies to a class 9C. If you wanted to use the type C construction, again, the building needs to be solely 9C use. The ABC has produced a video on this on their website or YouTube channel. It's called "Does C15 Still Apply If a Building Has a Basement Car Park?" But the concept is still kind of applicable to these scenarios. So further with fire resistance, so issues were identified with the application of specification C1.1 where a performance solution was not used. These included specifying the wrong fire resistance levels, not specifying an FRL where an FRL was required, not having the appropriate evidence of suitability to confirm that the FRL would be achieved, relying on a Red Book CSR system. However, the system detailed on the plans was not identical to that in the Red Book, and there was no report from the accredited testing laboratory to support the change from the tested prototype, and also using internal CSR wall systems in external wall types. We did also identify some issues with performance solutions, and these included performance solutions not addressing all of the deviations from the DTS. For example, we had a building where the fire engineering provided for the top story to have a reduced FRL, and the rest of the building also had reduced FRLs, which didn't comply with the DTS. Furthermore, we also identified that the requirements of fire engineering reports to support the performance solution were not detailed in the plans, and some of the requirements in the fire engineering could not be achieved. An example of this was that a smoke lobby was required in a basement. However, the plan showed that there was an open stair. Also with the rise in story, there was 2 sloping sites where the rise in stories were incorrectly calculated, as the RBS failed to identify that there was a non-street frontage where the elevation had a greater number of stories. So for compartmentation and separation, the most significant non-compliances were 8 audits where the RBS could not have been satisfied that the vertical separation of the openings in type A construction complied. There was 10 class 2 buildings with insufficient separation provided to public corridors, bounding SOUs, and in 7 buildings there was insufficient separation of the equipment listed in C212A. The most prevalent non-compliances were caused by the incorrect FRL and no performance solution to reduce the FRL, or the nominated wall or floor system not achieving the required FRL. Openings in the wall that were not compliant with C3 protection of openings, which reduced the wall's FRL, and lift shafts that were required to be separated from the remainder of the building had the incorrect FRL or no FRL around the lift shaft being nominated. The compliance rate for protection of openings was one of the lowest at 43%. Sufficient information was only provided in 47% of the audits. On average, there were 4 items per audit for Part C3 protection of openings where compliance was not demonstrated. A performance solution or a combination of solutions was used in 38 of the 56 buildings that required the openings and external walls to be protected. It was identified that in the audits that where performance solutions for the protection of openings were addressed using a performance solution via fire engineering, not all of the openings that required protection had been covered. And also that the fire engineering proposed alternative options for protecting the openings, such as glazing thickness, sprinkler protection or screening. However, the option being used was not detailed on the plans. In 10 of the audits, bounding construction with a public corridor did not comply or have sufficient information to demonstrate compliance had been achieved. This included doorways to public corridors that did not have the required FRL or thickness nominated, a test report that was not provided that demonstrated they achieved the required FRL, and travel along open balcony or the like to an exit required passing and opening in a external wall that were not provided with the required protection. For access and egress, so the provisions of escape had the highest compliance rate in the audits, which is really good, with 89% compliance achieved. This was achieved through a mixture of performance solutions and DTS solutions, or a combination of these. Key findings for provisions of escape are, in most cases, the basements were provided with only one exit under a performance solution, and 35 of the audits utilised a performance solution or a combination of solutions for travel distances. There were, however, some errors in the measured travel distance nominated in the performance solution, which led to incorrect calculation for travel times to exit. So it's probably just one of the ones that we'd highlight, that when you're kind of looking at fire engineering reports, making sure that they've got the distances accurate there. So services and equipment, sufficient information was provided in 61, 58 and 78% of the time for firefighting equipment, smoke hazard management and visibility in an emergency exit signs and warning systems respectively. And this resulted in similar compliance rates. As we can see, we've got 56 for firefighting, 58 for smoke hazard and 76 for visibility in an emergency. Although report and consents from the chief officers were generally obtained for fire hydrant coverage shortfalls, there were instances where they had not been obtained for fire hydrants on mid-landings and also for some coverage shortfalls. There were also audits where no pressure flow tests to support the use of street hydrants were obtained before issuing the permit. And we also identified architectural drawings and services drawing having conflicting information. For example, the hydrant locations were in different spots. So for weatherproofing, the key finding here was that 82% of the audits didn't demonstrate that the performance requirement FP 1.4 had been met. As there's no DTS, there should always be a performance solution. So the missing information was there was either no performance solution for any of the external walls, the performance solution was only for some of the external walls, the evidences of suitability being relied on was not appropriately assessed. For example, limitations and conditions of code marks not met, and where a code mark or the like was relied on for the external wall, the RBS did not undertake a determination as required under Regulation 38. So just briefly with performance solutions, since July 21, Clause A2 of the NCC has required a performance-based design brief be prepared. The clause kind of requires a final report to be prepared, and the size and volume of that information will depend on the complexity of the performance solution, with a full design brief report required for complex performance solutions, but may be a one page or less for the more simpler kind of ones. Most of the information in the final report is also required as part of your Regulation 38 determinations. And I just highlight these as we often found that the Reg 38 determinations weren't completed, and that also we'll be monitoring for design briefs going forward. Lastly, with performance solutions, it's important to ensure that the design requirements are achievable and are detailed and consistent with the plans and specification. We found the required fire engineering reports, like information required in the fire engineering reports, was not detailed on the plans, and as I mentioned before, not necessarily achievable. Just conscious of time, I'm just going to skip evidence of suitability. The audits, just a summary, is the audits found that there was insufficient information to demonstrate that the building's permits comply with the Act, Regs and the NCC. So going forward, we'll be looking to see improvements in the following items. Building permit documentation detailing sufficient information to determine compliance. Requirements of performance solutions being detailed on plans so that they are implemented in construction. Evidence of suitability being provided where required to demonstrate a material or product complies to avoid non-compliant products being installed, and inconsistencies between plans being rectified before issuing the permit to avoid confusion on site. Just lastly, just wanted to touch on the year ahead, and Andrew's kind of mentioned a lot of these things already, but we'll continue in 2022 to audit all the practitioners with an increased focus on those issuing Class 1 buildings. We'll continue with the Class 2 and other high-risk building, cladding rectification, the implementation of the performance-based design briefs, auto mutual recognition practitioners and new registrants, the Building Surveyor Code of Conduct and Administration, and other areas where there have been legislative changes. There will also be further refinement of our processes, including site selection, as we increase our capability and understanding from the data we've already gathered. We'll continue to enhance the way we use data from BAMs, our complaints, proactive inspections, statewide cladding, PDU investigations and PRAC Intel teams, and how we share our data across the organisation and the industry for education and regulatory improvement. Lastly, we welcome your feedback on our audit program as we strive to improve the way we audit to achieve a constructive relationship with industry and a quality built environment. Once again, I'd just like to thank the councils for their ongoing assistance, and also those practitioners and for their cooperation in providing responses to demonstrating compliance has been achieved. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keeshe. That was rather a sobering assessment of what's being found in these audits, clearly suggesting some issues with the quality of design, but also, I guess, with the willingness of surveyors to accept poor quality design, and obviously also an issue in there around fire engineering as well. So lots of issues. I guess the positive on it is that this work is being done. As Keeshe says, it will inform the education program, and I would also fully expect that those surveyors involved in these audits are getting feedback on what's being found as well. So let's try and think positive, but there seems to be quite a bit of work to do to turn those numbers around.